To another edition of the Capital Conversation podcast. Today we're going to talk about, the coronavirus. It's wrapping up now, how it's impacted daily life and how it's impacted politics, both like now, the current election scope, but also, politics in the future and the way that we campaign and such like that.
I think an interesting contrast that you're seeing with the virus is how the experts get on TV and say local businesses are failing, the economy is de facto closed, everything is shut down, people are losing jobs, people need stimulus checks to get by, but the stock market has actually almost fully recovered from the coronavirus back when it first dipped in, early February, mid-February?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting dichotomy there when you see people struggling to live day to day, getting laid off, unemployment's almost at 16%, but the wealthiest of us are actually...
Yeah, the 1% are still making it out okay and even turning a profit out of the coronavirus. And, I was saying almost from day one that was, a very, very easy market to day trade in because the predictability of the market, one, if you follow it, you can easily deduce the trends, but two, you have so much stuff that is down at 52-week lows that, Fortune 500 companies that are going to bounce back, it's easy to find a margin and kind of, ride that uptick as the market starts to correct itself. So a lot of the Wall Street guys, obviously a terrible situation, but it's akin to 2008 where these big Wall Street guys, the experts are going to come out okay by, making money off of other people's losses.
Yeah, and it doesn't take a genius to do it. You see the market go straight down in a matter of 2 weeks with really only a virus disrupting supply chains. Many of these companies don't really have any huge financial issues long term, but in the short term they got killed, so it's easy to jump in and make a quick profit, or a long profit if you want to hold on to it.
When you know that the government is stepping in to bail them out, like they're hurting in this moment, but in the future they're going to be okay because of this government stimulus, that's all the more reason to get in while the stock is down. Boeing is a prime example of that. They're going to be receiving, billions from the government, and that stock is down, $300 in the fiscal year?
Yeah, something like that. It's quite a bit. And again, like companies for Boeing, this might actually be sort of a godsend. Boeing was, I'm not going to say they're close to failing, but they had a couple of pretty bad beats.
Well, they had their own problems, and their stock was on the downtrend prior to the coronavirus hitting, but the coronavirus actually may have mitigated some of the losses for Boeing because it allowed them to keep up with some of their competitors in that defense, area where Huntington Ingalls and companies like that were starting to surpass them because of all the problems that Boeing had with the commercial airline, the problems with the 737 and things like that. But now all the other companies are down, all the other companies are hurting in cash flow and the profits, so it makes it actually a lot less bad for Boeing because they were already hurting in general.
Yeah.
So.
And connecting the economy to politics a little bit, if you'd asked us in January what the biggest voting issues would be, a global pandemic certainly wouldn't have even made the top 100, I don't think, for either of us.
Right, and the economy was a big thing in Trump's back pocket, and instead what we saw was the stock market being the lowest that it had been in the Trump presidency, hitting in March, I believe it was, sometime in mid-March, and very quickly, within a matter of a week and a half to 2 weeks of just awful days in the stock market, all the gains that had occurred in the President Trump administration had been given back in the Dow. So he no longer has that as a talking point, and I've said that I think that you could see a lot of fiscal conservatives that, and even just people that were, doing self-interest voting that would vote for him because they're making more money, because their portfolios are strong, the economy's strong, life in America is pretty good right now, all told. We're willing to forgive some of the things that annoyed them, the character problems with President Trump, tweeting, some foreign policy disconnect, our world image, all being hurt a little bit by his administration, willing to forgive those things because of how strong the economy was. That's not really the case anymore, especially for the non-college educated white male, the little guy that, at such high populations votes for President Trump. So it'll be interesting to see whether those people start to flee his campaign you know, as this continues to grow, and you know, he's lost that economic factor.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. But it's also interesting to note that as the economy tanked in mid-March and the pandemic spread, Trump's numbers actually went up. Like, you'd think the one thing he hangs his hat on is the economy. Like, you know, you'll forgive the tweets and the sexual misconduct and the foreign relations and all this other stuff, but, you know, as long as your bank account's going up, you'll vote for him. And now you see the economy start to go downwards, but Trump's numbers went up in mid-March, and I think that's because the American people wanted somebody to rally behind. So I'm not sure how much that is President Trump and how much that is just the fact that he was the president, but it's weird how everybody was saying Trump's, you know, successes are attached to the economy, and if the economy dips, he'll certainly lose election. At least that's what I thought.
Yeah, I don't think he'll certainly lose. I think it's more of a question now than it was before. I think both you and I were saying that we figured he'd be pretty darn hard to beat come November, just a few months ago, and I don't think that's the case anymore. I think we very much have a race. Part of that is the fact that Joe Biden locked up in the basement is an A-plus thing for his campaign. But also part of that is that Trump has lost a lot of his, you know, things that he can tout and rally behind.
And a lot of the hardest hit states by the coronavirus are blue states, so that gives some of these, you know, younger Democratic politicians a real platform to show their
It's
leadership.
really brought them to the limelight. I mean, if you think about Governor Cuomo, I mean, he was not somebody that was really universally beloved by even New York Democrats. I mean, he was certainly not one of the overwhelmingly popular governors in the country, and you know, he was a Democrat in New York. Like, obviously, New York is a very blue state. They like their Democrats, but they didn't love Cuomo. I mean, they thought he was like a 6 out of 10, 5.5 out of 10 governor. And now he's a political star and someone that, you know, the DNC is looking at as maybe, I mean, obviously he's older, so he's not a young star, but somebody that could have a national future in politics. And, you know, Biden did promise a female vice president, but I have read articles that have, you know, questioned and discussed whether, you know, Cuomo could be potentially someone that they look for on that ticket. And, you know, even more far-fetched people have mentioned, you know, a doomsday convention scenario or a chaos convention scenario where the delegates turn to Cuomo as the presidential nominee, which, I mean, I don't think that will happen. I think that, first of all, they'll have to deal with, you know, major problems from all the Bernie bros within the party if they were to do something like that. And after the calamity that was 2016 for the DNC and how that whole primary cycle ended up, I think they would look very undemocratic by having somebody that wasn't even on the ballot end up as the nominee. But changing gears back to what you mentioned before with the polling, I think that is an interesting point, and we won't really know until November, you know, what the reason was behind Trump's polling increasing. I mean, if you look back to 9/11, like, Americans weren't enamored with necessarily the way that President Bush handled that whole crisis and the Iraq War and all that stuff, but his numbers were sky high. I mean, up to the high 80s and 90s in the aftermath of 9/11, just because we saw a country that was really coming together and starting to just rally behind the government in general and root for American success, not Republican success or Democratic success. And so, you know, Trump's numbers increasing could be a result of that. I mean, we've seen a lot more friendly interactions, not really in Congress. I mean, that still has been very partisan, but between Trump and the governors, we've seen a lot more like willingness to speak kindly of one another, work together, compliment each other on the good jobs and the good work that they've done. And so I think that's what the American people want to see, is they want to see bipartisanship, they want to see unity, and the fact that that's happened has meant that everybody's poll numbers have increased. And I mean, that may not be the case. The American people may think that President Trump is doing a better job than everybody else out there that's handling the virus, but just, I mean, if you ask me, I think that it's more of a, you know, broad scale increase in polling than it is specific to President Trump.
Well, it seems to me that people's main voting issue now is not how bad the coronavirus gets or how it affects the economy or whether they can go to work or not, because I think they view that as sort of like a third person, you know, objective thing that you can only control but so much, just because it's a virus and politics and boundaries and state lines don't really affect it, but rather how measured and tempered and controlled and just like how much of a leader their governor is, or their president is, or even their mayor is. I think you'll see a lot of local officials gain or lose popularity within their communities because of this as well. But it seems that people are really disattached from how the coronavirus affects their daily life in terms of their stock portfolios or whether they have a job, but rather just how they view the politicians have done just reacting to the virus. And I think that's why you see people like Cuomo jumping up in the polls, because economically he's just killing New York. I think they are $13 billion in the hole in the past couple of weeks just because of this. And he slammed the relief package that came to the president, saying that it didn't do enough for New York. And I think there's a lot of people who would say that he was wrong to do that. He's now cleaning, along with Mayor de Blasio, he's sanitizing the New York public transit system every day, which is going to cost over $2 billion in the next 2 months, which is all going towards the public debt. And I think you could reasonably argue that that money spent does not justify cleaning the transit system every day, for example. And there's a lot of stuff like that. And I think you'll see a lot of people retrospectively look at this and say too much money was spent on things that didn't improve our lives enough to justify it. So right now I think everybody's saying, he's acting very well, he's being a leader and he's getting money for us, but once the effects of that trickle in, I think you'll see a lot of retrospective voting when it comes to how they financially reacted to the coronavirus.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think that in addition to what you said and kind of tacking onto it, I think, just a comment that politics in general have taken a lot less importance in people's day-to-day lives. I mean, we're in a situation now where, for a lot of people in this country, a lot of people, next meal, where I'm going to go to bed at night within the next month, how I'm going to feed my children, do I have a job in 2021, things like that are in serious question for, a tremendous amount of people. And so, I think that the semantics and that whole, question of do I like my politician, who am I thinking of in 2020, what's better for me in this, bonus stuff that isn't essential, but, it's better to have than to not have sorts of issues, or even the abortions and things like that are usually huge election issues are not as important to people anymore because their livelihoods are in question.
Yeah, I mean, if you tell somebody that, people are going, thousands of people are going to die unless, this person steps in, I don't think you're going to say, well, no, I don't want that because he's a Democrat, or I don't want that because he's a Republican. I think when it comes to stuff this serious, people are more willing to cast aside politicking and labels and parties just to ensure that everybody's safe and well and happy to the best that they can. So I think in November, it's going to be interesting to see how well voters evaluate Trump's performance in responding to the virus. Because I've seen a lot of outlets say he's done a great job. He's got the stimulus pushed through Congress quickly. He's worked with China well. He's managed the national stockpile well. And then there's other people like Governor Cuomo, for example, who say that he's not doing enough to help New York. He's trying to commandeer the situation when it comes to reopening. He thinks that should be a state thing. Cuomo does, not Trump. And I think there's a lot of people who say he's gone poorly about this. And then recently he's made some comical comments about...
Yeah, I think I'm kind of shocked that this whole situation hasn't hurt him in the polls and in the view of the American people more than it seems to have, because some of those things that he said in some of those press briefings, like the ejecting yourself with bacteria,
sunlight in the human body.
when he asked one of the White House doctors whether we tried heat and light to kill the virus. I mean, it's just some of those things that you just can't believe it's real life and that this person is the president of the United States when you hear those things come out of his mouth, especially in a time like this. So, he has done some good things, and he's directed some of his underlings and, Republican Party members in Congress to compromise and to get some packages done. But I think in terms of promoting stability and welfare for the American people and confidence in their elected officials, he's probably lacked in that regard. And, I'm kind of surprised that the American people haven't been more upset by it. And, that whole piece about wanting to reopen the country, he's been very clear that it's in his best interests to have the economy start to recover, start to function fully again, and have us start going back to resuming our daily lives. I mean, he has an election to win, and he fully intends on winning that election, and so he wants to have the policy be the best suited for him to win that election, which typically, again, doesn't play well to the American people. So, I'm just kind of surprised that, this is certainly not Trump's forte, handling a national crisis, and I'm surprised that he's been received as well as he has.
Well, I think part of it is people are a lot more politically forgiving when there's something like this going on, like in a war, for example. People tend to rally around the president regardless, or in, I guess, pandemics as well. And I think it goes across the aisle too. Cuomo has made some pretty insensitive comments actually at his briefings. He called homeless people disgusting for sleeping in the subways, as they have been for the past 50 years in New York City. And now it's an issue, and he didn't, it's an insensitive thing to say, and he caught some heat for that. Gavin Newsom in California also authorized $125 million of aid to support undocumented people in California. And again, he got a lot of pushback from that, but none, like his numbers in California aren't dipping too much either, despite the fact that he's actually made some pretty big missteps. I mean, California was, well, Newsom was saying he was going to close public beaches and shut down the state a lot earlier than he actually did. There was actually a 2-week gap between when he said he was going to do it and when it did, and they say that costs, X amount of lives and whatever. And typically a politician would take a lot of heat from that. But when it comes to polling, there seems to be some buffer in place for both President Trump and these prominent Democratic governors.
I don't think opinions are being changed, and I think some of that is probably, like I said earlier, that people just aren't really concerned with evaluating their politicians right now. They're more concerned about their lives. And, they have what they have, and they're trying to make it on themselves to, pull themselves out of this, make the best situation for themselves and their family, which is really the American way. So I think that's good to see, and obviously, hopefully it works out the best for everybody, but it's good to see people, not expecting the politicians to do things for them and trying to figure it out themselves.
Yeah, and I think someone, and we sort of touched on this, but Joe Biden's in an interesting spot in this pandemic because the spotlight has been taken off, the him versus Bernie clash for the Democratic nomination, or the him versus Trump clash for the presidency, but rather the virus. And in many respects, that's good for him. He's not the most proficient public speaker. He kind of tends to have gaffes a lot. And it's probably best for him to be camped up in his basement where he can't talk and say something stupid. But at the same time, leaders are made in times like this. Like, now would be a great time for Joe to get out there and really tell people and have them rally around him and say, this is what should be done, this is what we need to do it now, and get people to come to him.
That's how you win an election in a landslide. And, I think if Cuomo had some sort of national position as opposed to being just the governor of New York, like, just because of how people have clung to him and appreciated not necessarily what he's done. I mean, you've mentioned just a couple of minutes ago a couple of questionable decisions he made, but a lot of it comes down to the eloquence, the rhetoric, and just how it makes people feel to listen to them. If you go back and you think about the fireside chats with FDR, or you think about Reagan during the Cold War, like, it wasn't so much what they did as that their words inspired confidence in the American people. And I think Cuomo has reached that level with his daily briefings, the same as those two did. And, Biden's missed an opportunity, and I don't know if it's within his capability, but it certainly was a window for somebody who's in the national spotlight to really step up and gain a lot of favorability from the American people, because like you said, it's when leaders are made. But it will be interesting, once the world starts to resume and we start to gather together, closer than 6 feet apart, and with more than 10 people, with more than 50 people, with more than 100 people, having sporting events and stuff like that again, and resume normal life. Whether this will change, like, how political campaigning is done and things like that, because there have been a lot of people that have said that, we've never faced a virus this bad, a pandemic this bad in this country, and that daily life may vastly change, that people may never congregate together in the magnitudes that we used to see be normal, and people have refuted that, people have backed it up, so we'll be interested to see. But if just thinking very, very short term into this 2020 election, if people are not willing in August or in September or in July to gather in these big stadiums and hangars and stuff like that to go to a Trump rally, for fear of a second wave or for fear of catching another, viral disease or something like that, then I think that cuts off from the legs one of Trump's big, campaign mechanisms. I mean, he really does the best at being there with a group of people and, firing up the crowd, rallying the base. And he can't do that now, and if he can't do that up to the 2020 election, then, I think that hurts him tremendously, and it'll also be interesting to see, if that sets a trend in politics and we continue to transition away from the rallies into other means of campaigning.
Yeah.
And what kind of politician does that foster to be more successful?
Yeah. What's also going to be interesting to watch is how the election is done in November, because there's not going to be a vaccine developed by then. There's certainly still going to be some guidelines as to how close people can get, and in-person voting is going to be something that a lot of people aren't going to feel comfortable with.
Yeah, turnout is going to be a huge question.
Yeah. And in New York, for example, Governor Cuomo is mailing free of charge, not an option. Everybody's getting an absentee ballot mailed to them for the state elections. And that favors Democrats hugely because many Democrats just traditionally, historically, don't show up to the polls to vote. But if they get a ballot, delivered to them without them knowing free of charge, I think most people would be more willing to just sit on their couch, fill it
Check
out,
a box
mail it
and
in.
stick it in the mailbox.
So a lot of Republicans are saying, just like you have to choose and be active and go out to the polls and vote, you should have to request an absentee ballot to vote, and it shouldn't just be mailed to you. Like, you're an adult, you're perfectly able to do that, and it's your choice to vote. We don't force people to vote here. So I think that's going to be a really big logistical question as far as...
Well, it's going to set up a huge ideological clash because the Republicans, are very, very much against mail-in voting as a general principle. They believe that it increases voter fraud, and while we know that voter fraud is not a huge problem in this country, it's undeniable that voter fraud does increase when mail-in voting increases. Now, the percentages are still extremely low. It is a 1% to 2% type of thing, but it does increase. And as a principle, they're against mail-in voting. Trying to prevent voter fraud is a big deal to Republicans, and I think that it's going to lead to several probably landmark Supreme Court cases that are going to end up deciding how this 2020 election is decided. Yeah. And we already saw, some precedents in Wisconsin when they denied the mail-in voting that the Democratic legislature Democratic governor tried to pass, right?
Yeah. And the court ruled that, they didn't have to accept the mail-in voting at that point, and the election stood. But I think no matter how the court rules or however it's decided that the election's going to be done, one side is going to try to illegitimize it. Republicans are going to say...
Well, we're going to have another situation on our hands like 2016. There's going to be some claim that the election was stolen from the other candidate, no matter who it is. And, people have started to suggest that if Trump loses, that he could refuse to leave office. And I think that the situation that we're probably in for in the next 6 months increases that likelihood. I mean, I don't think we'll see that. I'd be shocked. But I think that likelihood does certainly increase by this situation that we're in now. I mean, there's going to be questions about the voting process and how it goes, and it's going to have a big impact on turnout, one way or the other, depending on how the voting works.
There's even been talk of pushing the election. They say, they say there's going to be a vaccine sometime in early 2021. So some Democrats are saying, hey, let's push the election to summer of 2021. And the interesting thing there is Trump's term ends in early January. So, and as does Pence's. So, and as does Pelosi's. Pelosi would be out. So at that point, I think it said Chuck Grassley, if that were to happen, would assume the presidency. Yeah, would assume the presidency in late January. And for those unfamiliar, Chuck Grassley, I love the guy, but he would not be a good president. Like, that's kind of a not the best option, I think, for Americans. So And if that were to happen, would Trump refuse to leave the office? I mean, I could see that happening. He'd say, I haven't been voted
I
out.
think he certainly would.
And that would be
I don't
a
agree with
huge
you on
issue.
Chuck Grassley would be a bad president. I mean, he's a little old, for
He's
sure,
ancient.
but he's a highly competent man, a bipartisan fella, Iowa strong.
Either way, I think that would present a whole host of constitutional issues.
My favorite U.S. senator, by the way,
And
for the folks at home.
and on both sides of the aisle, that would also bring huge questions about how we elect our officials and maybe illegitimize how the government is
Yeah,
run for at
it
least
would
a
be
few months.
Groundbreaking to push an election back by 6 months. And, you know, if we wanted to pass any legislation during that period, which, I mean, we would have to pass some legislation, and if you're thinking about it, I mean, that's when the budget is passed every
Yep.
year, is in that window between, what'd you say, May, April?
Yeah, they're saying the vaccine will be ready in March and deployable by late April, so they'd want to have
Okay,
the election.
so March,
in June.
April, between November and April, let's say, so in that 5-month window, that's, you know, when we pass the new budget, and, you know, there's plenty of things that need to get done during that period. Taxes,
Mhm.
so, you know, new tax policy, so if any legislation is passed during that time, which it would have to be, is it legitimate, you know, how long does it last, and, you know, because it's not really formed by a government that's been elected by the people, I mean, elected to some office, but not the office that they would be holding.
Yeah, and I think we might have to reconsider the line of succession. I mean, the president pro tempore and the president has always, and the Senate, not the president, has always been sort of an honorific position, like you just give it to the most senior member.
No responsibilities, it's
Yeah.
literally just goes
But
to the senior member.
If that were to happen and people see, you know, oh my gosh, just like that, we can actually have the president pro tempore ascend to the presidency, I think that might, you know, I don't know how things would have to change, but I'm sure there would be some sort of movement to change the line of succession to something else, or maybe take a little more in-depth look at who you appoint to be.
Well, I mean, I don't know that that's a calamitous thing, though. I mean, typically the person that is the most tenured in the majority party in the Senate is a very, very well-respected figure, a competent individual, you know,
Could be Bernie.
politically respected by both sides.
Could be Bernie.
So, I mean, I don't think that circumstance would cause us to have to change the line of succession. I mean, I think that's a bit of a reach.
That's what I do.
But, you know, Grassley is never somebody that's sought anything outside of the state of Iowa
No.
in his career, so it would kind of be a shock to see him accede the role as president.
Yeah.
Um,
And no matter what happens, you know, one way or another, whether it be contested election because of how voting is done, or contested election because the election itself is moved, which I think is probably less likely, but things are going to get dicey politically pretty soon, especially when it comes to electing the president in the fall, because it's just going to be very difficult to do so in a way that lines up with what we've done historically.
yeah. And I saw this interesting Wall Street Journal article, changing gears a little bit, about the stimulus spending. You okay there? That was pretty much spearheaded by the Republicans in Congress. $2 billion aid package that we saw go
Yeah.
out. And they were just kind of comparing and contrasting the economic, I mean, I don't want to call this a recession, but downturn, I think is a fine word to
Yeah, I
use,
think that's fair.
between the 2008 actual recession and this kind of economic downturn, and how Republicans refused and blocked legislation to put any sort of stimulus into the economy in 2008 when we had that recession, but now have been really at the forefront of giving stimulus and want to give more stimulus out, but have actually been blocked by the Democrats in doing so, or at least, I mean,
Yeah,
that's
well,
kind of a political comment in terms of the small businesses, but you know, the Journal was saying, like, it's interesting to note how far the Republican Party has transitioned.
I don't think that's
10,
fair.
12 years.
I think the main point there is that in 2008, market forces are what caused the economy to downturn. Like, the government didn't step in and make everybody stay at home. the banks overextended themselves and paid the price as a result and downturned the economy because of their own negligence. And the Republican view would be, if you do something bad that hurts your business, it's not my job to dive in and save you. But if the government is forcing you to stay home, and that's what causes you to lose your job or not be able to work, I mean, that's not really a bailout, that's the government forcing you to stay home, and that's not really a market thing.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough, but I think that, you know, the free market philosophy still holds that, you know, everything that comes down is going to correct and right itself back up without any sort of inflation needed. So at least thinking about the stock market and those big companies, I think a free market argument would be that, you know, over the course of time, this is going to end, not going to last probably longer than a couple of months. Now, a couple probably more weeks until we're decreasing every day. I
Yeah,
think countrywide, and then things will start to shift back, and the little fish might go bankrupt. But I mean, that's part of the free market philosophy. I think is
Yeah,
really what
I
they're
mean,
trying to hint at.
I think it's a little more
Ideologically.
nuanced than that, but
Sure.
I guess that's a good point. But yeah, that's all the time we have for today, actually. So we'll see you next time on the next installment of the Capital Conversation, and thanks for tuning in.